In previous videos, we tested Seafoam Deep Creep, and then in a separate video, we tested Liquid Wrench, and both of those won their respective showdowns. Is it possible, though, that there's a product that's even better for removing rusty bolts and nuts than Seafoam or Liquid Wrench? In some of the videos I've seen online, which I find very hard to believe, some people are using nothing other than candle wax to remove rusted parts. And if you have a wheel stud lug or a lug nut on a vehicle that's been in place for 20 years, it's going to be very hard to remove it if it's been exposed to weather and it's full of rust. So, is it possible that all you need is just a cigarette lighter and a candle in order to remove that rusty lug nut? Well, I'm not sure if that's a myth or not, but what I do know is by the end of this video, we'll all have some conclusive evidence as to whether or not this works. The first test involves determining whether or not using candle wax works better than using nothing at all. On the right, we have 4 bolts. This is an old sickle mower part that I used as scrap. It's just scrap steel for me. But I went ahead and torqued each one of these bolts down to 50 foot-pounds. This is a 7/16" bolt. And I allowed this to rust for a period of time. And I also used a rusting agent to create some rust. So we'll see how much force it takes to break these free. Normally, breakaway torque is less than the initial torque. So we should expect these to come loose at 50 foot-pounds or less if they weren't rusted at all. So let's see how much force it takes. Now you don't need a torch to do this according to the videos I've seen. You just take a regular lighter, you apply a flame to the very bottom of the nut, and then you allow it to heat up the nut to the point in which the wax melts. Now as the wax melts, in theory what's supposed to happen is the wax creeps in between, or it wickers in between the nut and the bolt, allowing it to fully penetrate and then of course loosen everything up. So let's put this to the test. We're going to use 4 different nuts to apply the wax to, and then we're going to test it against a control which involves no wax. We're also going to allow these to all cool down. As you can see, the wax has totally coated the entire nut and bolt, so it should have had a chance to wicker in. Since we applied heat and wax to the other group of bolts, we're only going to apply heat to this set of bolts just to make it fair, because heat in and of itself could break away some of the rust. So we'll apply heat for 30 seconds just like we did the other bolts, and then we'll allow it to cool. As you can see, the surface area of the nut and bolt is thoroughly coated with wax, and wax has actually gone down the side of the metal and has begun to drip off. At this point, everything is cooled off, so what I'm going to do now is measure the torque required to loosen each of these nuts. We're going to be using a torque adapter to measure the amount of force required to break free each one of these nuts. But what I do like about this specific model is it does measure the loosening torque, not just the tightening torque, and it also records the highest amount of torque required to break something free. So what I'll do now is remove this nut to see if we can find any sort of wax on the inside of the nut and bolt. I don't see any sign of wax on this bolt, so we're going to remove the next one to see if maybe there's some wax on that one. Just like the first bolt, there's no visible presence of wax. Just like the first 2 bolts, unfortunately, there's no visible sign of wax getting into the threads of this bolt. I'm going to remove the nuts on these bolts, and we'll compare them to the bolts that had wax applied to see if they look any different. So the bolt on the right had the wax applied, the bolt on the left didn't. I can't tell any difference between the 2 bolts. I'm just not seeing that the wax made any sort of progress getting into these threads. Now the previous set of nuts and bolts and this set have been rusted the exact same amount and torqued to 50 foot-pounds. Also, the bolts and nuts are the exact same size. I intentionally did not cause a whole lot of rust to occur with either one of these test setups because I wanted to see if wax would do anything on a mildly rusty nut and bolt. So what we're going to do now is apply an incredible amount of heat to these nuts and bolts, then drip wax directly on top of the bolt itself to see if wax will work its way into the threads. We're going to do that for just 2 nuts and bolts. The other 2 is more of our control. We're just going to apply heat and nothing as far as the wax, and we'll compare how much breakaway force is required to loosen these up. I'll just be using a propane torch to heat these nuts and bolts up. We're going to apply the wax to see if this is going to work. Go ahead and allow these bolts to cool off to room temperature, and then we're going to see how much torque it takes to remove them. We're going to start off by seeing how much torque it takes to loosen the 2 bolts that only had heat applied, and then we're going to test the 2 that had the candle wax. Okay, the metal is totally cooled off. Now the entire piece of steel is 78, 79 degrees Fahrenheit. There are no visible traces of wax on this bolt. Unfortunately, it does not look like this is working. So I'm very curious as to whether or not a penetrating fluid would do a better job than candle wax or having nothing. So what we do now is apply a lot of heat just like we did before using a propane torch. And then I'm going to spray this down with Seafoam Deep Creep. This is the badly rusted wheel stud lug that we heated up to about 700 degrees Fahrenheit and then used candle wax on top of it. So what I'm going to do is see how much torque it takes to break it loose. Now I'm not going to take it off. Once I break it loose, I'm going to actually cut this nut off so we can actually see if there's candle wax that's made it into the threads. There's no visible signs of wax on these threads. It did not do a good job as far as penetrating. The Seafoam made thorough penetration. It is still on the threads, even though the reciprocating salt did cause a lot of heat and we saw some of that evaporating off. Now it did what it's supposed to do. It actually penetrated and helped release the nut. The candle wax, on the other hand, it took about 2.5, almost 3 times as much force to break the nut free, and there's no visible signs of candle wax on these threads. Well, I don't know about you, but if I've got to deal with a rusty nut and bolt in the future, I'm not going to be using candle wax. It did absolutely nothing for me besides make a mess. Now, I watched quite a few videos on YouTube to figure out the different strategies to apply the wax, and I tried a couple of those on this video, and neither one of them seemed to work at all. What did work was applying the penetrating fluid to the rusty nut and bolt. I don't recommend using heat when you use the penetrating fluid just because it can reach auto ignition and catch on fire. And obviously you've got to be safe. You don't want to do that. As I like to say, work smarter, not harder, and definitely be safe. Now, regarding the approach I used, different people have different opinions on this approach. If you think I did a poor job, I'd like to hear your comments on what I should have done differently. I always learn from you guys. There's a lot of different opinions, and I read every comment. So I look forward to reading your comments, and I look forward to future video ideas. Until next time, please take care, and I look forward to seeing you then.